My name is François Crépeau. I'm Professor of Public International Law and I'm the Director of the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. My colleague Nandini Ramanujam, who is over there, and is the Executive Director and Director of Programs at the Center, and I welcome you to the 2019 Wallenberg Lecture with Justice Leona Theron. We would also like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of our Dean, Robert Leckie, who regrets not being able to be with us today. 3 named human rights lectureships were created in the 1980s, thanks to our colleague and friend, Professor Erwin Kotler, who will address you in a few minutes. Since its creation in 2005, the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism has the privilege of assuming the stewardship of the human rights lectureships, effectively using them to bring distinguished and diverse voices to the faculty, to the university, and to the community at large. The 3 lectures honor John Peters Humphrey, Ronnie Cassin, and Howard Wallenberg. Speakers of national and international renown have participated in these lectures. Most recently, for the Wallenberg Lecture, Stephen Lewis in 2014, Harold Coe in 2016, and Supreme Court Justice Rosalia Bella in 2017. We would like to thank Mr. Manny Schechter, whose generous contribution allows the Wallenberg's lectureship to bring to McGill the greatest minds from far away. Raoul Wallenberg stood up against the Nazi regime and did what most of his fellow diplomats did not dare to do. Arriving in Budapest in July 1944, he started issuing protective passports, quotation marks, which identified the bearers, mostly Hungarian Jews, as Swedish subjects and awaiting repatriation, and thus he prevented their deportation to death camps. Although illegal, these documents looked official and were generally accepted by German and Hungarian authorities, who sometimes were also bribed. In today's terms, Paul Wallenberg would be deemed a migrant smuggler and a passport forger and be punished for this activity. Wallenberg also rented 32 buildings in Budapest and declared them to be extraterritorial, protected by diplomatic immunity, putting up signs such as the Swedish Library on their doors and hanging huge Swedish flags on them to bolster the deception. The buildings eventually housed almost 10,000 people. During the siege of Budapest by Soviet forces, Wallenberg is also said to have prevented an attempt to blow up the Jewish ghetto and to organize a death march for the remaining Jews. He was arrested by Soviet authorities in January 1945 and disappeared in Russian jails. It was later said, at the end of the 50s, that he had died in detention in July 1947 at the age of 35. This is an inspiring story, which speaks to us today. We look at the world as it is, and we sadly reckon that protecting the marginalized, sheltering people in precarity, saving human lives, whomever they may be, is still not considered a primordial duty for states and individuals alike when territorial sovereignty or divisive politics interfere. In universities such as this one, students are constantly pushing us to do more, each generation of them bringing new or renewed human rights issues to the fore. They ask us to help them change the world. For example, through diversifying the faculty and student body to reflect our diverse societies and avoid simply reproducing the elites. Or through tackling with more intensity the environmental issues, such as climate change. Or through being more creative in our analysis of older human rights issues, such as labor exploitation, or repressive migration policies, or gender-based discrimination. They bring to the faculty the plurality of their perspectives and of their concerns, and they constantly keep us on our feet. Lectureships, such as the Wallenberg Lecture, allow us to invite great minds to speak to new or renewed global human rights challenges, to their local consequences on individuals and communities, and to the various pathways towards respecting and protecting the rights and freedoms of those under threat. The presence today of a Justice of the South African Constitutional Court in our Maxwell Cohen Moot Court is also a testimony to a growing community of friends and allies of the Centre across the world. During the winter of 2020, under the auspices of our International Judicial Clerkship Programme, we shall send a recent graduate of the faculty to the Constitutional Court of South Africa to work as a law clerk. Our honoured guest of today, Justice Leona Theron, will thus speak to the formidable challenge of equality in South Africa. This will resonate here in Canada as well. How can we realise the objective of providing an equal access to all rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and of providing it to all, regardless of origin or status, when profound wealth and power differentials are fracturing our societies under the often indifferent gaze of the privileged few? How can we support the rightful claims to equal treatment from people with disability, Indigenous peoples, from the LGBTIQ+ community, from migrants, including refugees, from children, from minorities, from victims of generalized violence, and from so many others? Before we introduce our guest speaker, I want to say how proud we are at the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism to be in a position to facilitate such conversations. In the case of the Wallenberg Lecture, we do it in collaboration with the Howard Wallenberg Institute, and I would like to ask its founding director, Professor Erwin Kotler, to say a few words. Professor Kotler doesn't need an introduction. When I was a student here, that's 40 years ago, Professor Kotler was already a legend, working towards the liberation of prisoners of conscience, such as Soviet dissident Anatoly Sharansky or anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela. Minister of Justice from 2003 to 2006, he's had to tackle many difficult issues, such as already then the decriminalization of marijuana, racism, or post-9/11 national security issues. He has recently been working with the Organization of American States on potential crimes against humanity in Venezuela. Professor Kotler, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Crabo. It's a really moving moment for me to return when I can to McGill Law School. This was not only where I studied and where I was a faculty member, but it was really my home for close to 40 years. And so for me, it's always a return to be amongst family. And it's a particularly auspicious occasion to be here today. The Ralph Wallenberg Lectureship in Human Rights was inaugurated in this moot court in 1987 by the then Nobel Peace Laureate Eloise Wiesel, who months before received the Nobel Peace Prize, in what became an international commemorative event for the case and cause for human rights. And I just want to mention to Justice Theron that amongst those who were here on that occasion at the inaugural of the Ralph Wallenberg Lecture in Human Rights was Arthur Chaskelson, who had acted as counsel to Nelson Mandela, who was to become the first president of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and he was here at that very historic moment. And we are delighted to be able to welcome you here today. There's been a long tradition of a connection between this law school, the Wallenberg Center, South Africa, and the like. The Wallenberg Lecture was established in memory and in tribute to Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish non-Jew who became Canada's first honorary citizen, who's been credited with saving 100,000 Jews in the last 6 months of 1944, and who demonstrated, and I think this is an inspirational role model for all the things that you mentioned, Francois, about students being engaged in human rights, who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act could confront evil, prevail, and transform history. In the 6 weeks between end of May and the beginning of July 1944, 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to the death camps in Auschwitz, the fastest, most cruelest, most efficient killing field in all of the Holocaust. And no one could say at that time that we did not know. Raoul Wallenberg arrived in mid-July in the Swedish legation in Budapest. And he managed, through bravado, bluff, incredible courage and commitment, to save, as the United Nations said, and became the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century through such initiatives as Schutzpasses, which Professor Crapo mentioned, that conferred diplomatic immunity on their recipients, Swedish passports. Through that route alone, he saved 20,000 Jews. He set up diplomatic safe havens with other diplomats in Budapest at the time, through which medium another 25,000 were saved. Rendered humanitarian assistance through care for the elderly, the sick, children, all forms of humanitarian assistance. Would follow death camp marches to hand out Schutzpasses, would go down to the death transports as well. And perhaps his last rescue was the most memorable. When the Nazi generals threatened to blow up the Budapest ghetto, where some 60,000 Hungarian Jews were residing, Wallenberg warned them that if they were to go ahead and seek to blow up the ghetto, they would be held accountable for their crimes against humanity, as he himself characterized it at the time. And so they desisted, and 60,000 Jews were saved by that one act alone. I just want to close by mentioning that this occasion has also inspired students to set up a Wallenberg Human Rights Advocacy Group here at McGill. The occasion of your visit here, Justice Theron, is going to advocate for the liberation of political prisoners along the lines that Professor Crapo was mentioning that students can become engaged in, and in remembrance perhaps of the most compelling political prisoner of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela, who endured 27 years in a South African prison and emerged to not only preside over the dismantling of apartheid, but become the president of the first free, democratic, non-racial South Africa. So we meet today at a very compelling moment, and I'm delighted to have the combined inspiration of the Wallenberg Lectureship, the South African Mandela legacy, all represented here today by Justice Theron.
Many thanks, Professor Cutler. Professor Adele Blackett is a dear colleague. She is the Canada Research Chair in Transnational Labour Law and Development and the Director of the Labour Law and Development Research Laboratory here at McGill. She's worked as a legal expert with the International Labour Office in Geneva in the lead up to the adoption in 2011 of the ILO Convention number 189 on decent work for domestic workers. She also worked on the labour law reform process in Haiti from 2011 to 2014. She was a commissioner of the Quebec Human Rights and Youth Rights Commission from 2009 to 2016. Adele will introduce our guest speaker and facilitate the Q&A session. Adele, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. It is an immense pleasure for me to introduce the Honorable Leona Theron, Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and to welcome her here to McGill and to Montreal. the traditional unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederation and a place that has been a meeting ground for other indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe. Justice Theron was born in KwaZulu-Natal on the eastern coast of South Africa. Determined to excel, when she was just 12, it is told that she sold sweets that her mother baked, fudge and coconut ice, actually, to pay for her schooling and to pay for her piano lessons. She thrived academically, and she attended Natal University from 1984 to 1988, where she then completed a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws. In 1989, she was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship by the U.S. government and earned her Master of Laws degree from Georgetown University a year later. Of particular interest to us here at McGill, where we have been celebrating the centenary of the organization that took its temporary wartime refuge at McGill on the invitation of the Canadian government from 1940 to 1948, Justice Theron worked for the International Labor Organization in Washington, D.C., the office that currently serves both the United States and Canada. She was at that time a special assistant to the director. And as many will know, the ILO acted decisively, taking a strong anti-apartheid stance in its 1964 declaration concerning the policy of apartheid of the Republic of South Africa, that soon after the world watched breathlessly as the leader of the anti-apartheid movement, Nelson Mandela, was triumphantly released from prison on February 1990. He went to Geneva to thank the ILO for, quote, refusing to forget us, and that the ILO subsequently accompanied South Africa to put in place much of the labor relations framework that makes dispute resolution accessible to some of the lowest wage workers, and that is one of the many sites through which to question the meaning of equality in relation to socioeconomic rights, the fitting, timely subject of Justice Theron's talk. Justice Theron began her practice as an advocate of the High Court of KwaZulu-Natal late that same year, in December 1990. And she also lectured at the University of Natal. And then, in 1995, then President Mandela appointed her a member of the Judge White Commission, and only 4 years later, on 15th of October 1999, she was appointed as a judge of the High Court, becoming at that moment the first Black female judge to be appointed in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. She was all of 32 years old, almost 33, the youngest judge in the country. In December 2010, Justice Theron was appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court of Appeal, and she was yet again the youngest member of the Supreme Court of Appeal. And on the 1st of July 2017, she joined the South African Constitutional Court. Justice Theron sits on a number of boards, is vice president of the International Association of Women Judges. She's a founding member of the South African chapter of that association. She's delivered papers at numerous conferences within South Africa and internationally. She's also the mother of 4, and she is deeply respected for her commitment to equality, including women's equality. Justice Theron has, over the years, received numerous awards for her contribution to the development of justice in South Africa. They include the 2011 KZN Legal Forum Award for her contribution to the development of justice in South Africa, and the 2000 Department of Justice Women Achiever of the Year Award. and in 2014 she received a special recognition lifetime award from the Businesswomen's Association for her commitment to women's empowerment and her achievements as a judge. But mostly, when one speaks to those who have had the opportunity to meet Justice Theron, and from our short engagement, I think that already has become apparent, one senses a deep commitment, a humility, and a passionate engagement in favor of justice for the most marginalized. And so it is a true honor to be able to welcome you, Justice Theron, and to listen to your Wallenberg lecture entitled, Are We All Equal?
Thank you so much, Professor, for that moving introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Kotler, who has been instrumental in the human rights movement here at McGill, and we honor you today as well, sir, for your contribution. I also want to acknowledge the partnership between the Human Rights Centers at McGill University, as well as the University of Pretoria, and the work that's been done by Professor Frappo and Professor Ramanajan, who I met in South Africa and was one of the initiators of this invitation. I acknowledge all members of the legal profession that are here, academics, and all the students. It is truly an honor for me to be here today to deliver this prestigious lecture. The South African Constitution is one of the most progressive in the world, and it is internationally celebrated. However, 25 years into democracy, and inequality is still pervasive in South Africa. Apartheid has left the country with a legacy of disproportional disparity in wealth and access to opportunity. Despite constitutionally enshrined socioeconomic rights, our society is still confronted with highly unequal access to housing, healthcare, education, social security, and unemployment. This is so regardless of the fact that the Constitution requires the state to achieve the progressive realization of these rights by taking into account the needs of the people, vindicating their rights, and the state's available resources in giving effect to these rights. I think my talk is supposed to be changing the slides. My talk today will explore the evolving jurisprudence of the South African Constitutional Court. And your professor, the guilty party over there at the back, has asked me to share some of my personal journey with you this evening, which I'm very happy to do. At the time of Mr. Mandela's death, we were neighbors. I don't think he was too happy with us as his neighbors, because we bought the house and we renovated it. And my husband's a property developer. And we weren't staying in the house at the time, so he installed our workers at the house. So because the workers didn't have to have transport and come at a decent hour, maybe 8 o'clock, if they felt like starting work at 6 o'clock, they would. If they felt like working over the weekends, they would. And once when I met Mr. Mandela's personal assistant, because we had moved from a different province, so we hadn't taken up residence here, but when we did, and I met his assistant, he says, "Oh, the people, the noisemakers from next door that Mr. Mandela always used to complain about. My clerk will know that I almost never say what's in my speech. So I've just forgotten, where I was, and that wasn't part of my speech, but I think I was prompted to say that because of what the professor and Mr. Cotter spoke about Mandela. I think I just wanted my 5 minutes of fame. Although I did meet him in Washington, D.C., because I was a student there. I was studying at Georgetown upon his release. But before I get to that story, can I tell another one? I guess no one's going to say no. We're talking about the struggle against apartheid, and you all will know in South Africa when we demonstrate, we sing, we dance, and so it was a bit of a culture shock for me when I attended my first demonstration in the US, and it was outside the South African embassy, and it was before December. And we were walking around in a very orderly circle, which doesn't happen in South Africa, and waving with the flags, and we were saying, ho, 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 apartheid has got to go. And when I told my friends back home, this is how we demonstrated, y'all know at home was like, ho, and it's singing, and it's shouting, and it's dancing, so that always stays in my mind. But I mean, that's the difference of all. But in all of that, we had one goal, and the goal was the dismantling of apartheid. Now, speaking about Mr. Mandela, it may not surprise you to know that equality, which is the topic of what I'm talking about tonight, was an ideal for which Mr. Mandela was prepared to die. At his trial, this is a trial that resulted in him going to spend 27 years on Robben Island. In mitigation of sentence, he prepared a statement, and his counsel, one of whom was Arthur Chaskelton as well, they didn't want him to say that statement because at that stage we still had the death penalty in South Africa, and they knew that he was going away for a long time, but their ideal sentence was for him to get life imprisonment and not the death penalty. And they thought if he said what he did say, and this is what I'm going to tell you now, they thought it would actually not mitigate, but it would aggravate his sentence. And this is what he said. He said, I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live and to see realized. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. So he was saying to the judge, if you want to sentence me to death, you can do that. Now, I want to ask you, is there an ideal for which you are prepared to die? I often ask myself when I hear, because we often play, we got cassettes and on television, we try to encourage our generation with Mr. Mandela. I ask myself, what would I be prepared to die for? What I take from what Mr. Mandela said, that it's not enough to be free and equal. We need to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of other people. So my focus this afternoon is on equality. Yes, in the eyes of the law, we are all equal in South Africa. We all have the right to vote. The Constitution has abolished all forms of discrimination. But, and this is the question, are we all able to enjoy and give effect and content to that right of equality? If you look at South African judgments, you will see that we often cite Canadian authority. And I think the constitution that our South African constitution is closest to would be the Canadian constitution. The first case that was heard by the Constitutional Court concerned the death penalty, Makonyane. Many judges in that judgment referred to the Canadian stance. If you look at the judgment, you'll see the Canadian authority that was referred to. And in particular, they referred to the case of Kindler versus Canada, where the Canadian Supreme Court defined the death penalty as cruel and inhumane punishment. So I'll make sure my lecture is not too long. I do hope that the existing ties between South Africa and Canada, and especially in the legal fraternity, will be strengthened and renewed after my visit here. And we look forward to Theron. Where is he? We look forward to welcoming you in South Africa next year. And it's going to be a special experience. It's going to be so special that all your colleagues are going to want to come. And this is my law clerk, Tanvi. She's my foreign law clerk. She's from Mauritius. And she will tell you, obviously, he's learned about it too late, but mine is the best chambers to be in. I love going to work every day. I love the court, the symbolism of the court. Our courtroom, I think there's no other courtroom like ours in the world. If you're interested, come visit, come and meet me. I'll show you around, and we will show you around. If you can't get there, Google. You'll see that there is a panel where the judges sit. And then to our right is a panel, oh, this is not in my speech, so as you can see. There's a panel to the left, and it's windows. What we see are the legs of people walking past. What that symbolizes is that we, as the judges, are serving the people. That's the community that we serve. So we don't see their gender. We don't see their race. All we know is that those people that are walking past the courtroom, going about their business, are part of the people who are affected by the judgments that we deliver. That's just one of the symbolism in that court. And it brings light into the courtroom. It also symbolizes transparency, that what we do must be open for everybody to actually see. And the symbol of the Constitutional Court is a tree. So it's justice under a tree. Justice for the people, by the people. Justice that's accessible to people. It's not high up there people can't reach. Obviously, we have the challenges of legal costs and access to justice that everybody has. Maybe it's good if I just go to my speech a little bit. Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and Section 9 of the South African Bill of Rights, which both pertain to the right to equality, are similarly worded. Both sets of provisions prohibit discrimination on the basis of various grounds. Both allow for positive discrimination and affirmative action so as to improve the position of disadvantaged individuals and groups. There are ever differences. The most glaring is the fact that Canada is an affluent and stable democracy, while South Africa, in contrast, is a middle income which is still deeply unequal. Nearly 25 years ago, into an extraordinary, far-reaching political transition. The dispossession of land from black South Africans became central to colonialism and apartheid. And array of laws dating back to earlier colonialism entrenched racial inequality. Under the Native Land Act, only 13% of the area of South Africa was apportioned to black South Africans. The result was that 80% of the South African population was confined to 13% of the land, while 20% of the population owned over 80% of the land. Now, if you know anything about our transition, you will know that there was a property clause, there is a property clause in our constitution, which the majority of South Africans are not happy with. But what we had in South Africa was a negotiated settlement. And this was one of the compromises that was made. And it was to avoid bloodshed, it was to avoid a revolution. The strongest thing that the majority then held on to was the property. And 25 years later, into our democracy, there has not been effective redistribution of land. Because if you know South Africa's history, you'll know that in order to only allocate 13% of the land to the majority of the people, a lot of people had to be dispossessed of their land. They were taken off the land and put into settlements, and that land was given to others. And there's supposed to have been, well, there is a process of resettling, of giving people back land. But it's a process that has met many, many obstacles along the way. Parties have come to court, to the Constitutional Court, but there is only so much that the court can do. You will know that the property rights and Section 25 of the Constitution is a burning issue in South Africa. And if it's not properly addressed, you see what happened in Zimbabwe. The government is taking that under review, and they say they're going to be amending the Constitution. So we need to watch that space. The first democratic elections in 1994 brought about the promise for equal opportunity and an overall improvement of living standards of the majority of South Africans. The new government, yes, had invested in education, health services, social development. And the government has played a notable role in reducing poverty and inequality. The new government introduced social assistance to vulnerable households, which was never in place before. The new government implemented vast social security, public transport, and housing projects as redistributive measures, but they have not been enough. They have definitely had a material impact in reducing poverty and inequality. Close to 2.3 million South Africans escaped poverty between 2006 and 2015, in large part because of the social assistance program from the government. However, 25 years into democracy, levels of inequality remain stubbornly high. Inequality has actually increased since 1994. South Africa remains a dual economy with one of the highest inequality rates in the world. High inequality is perpetuated by a legacy of exclusion and the nature of economic growth, which is not pro-poor, and does not generate sufficient jobs. High unemployment is one of the key challenges for South Africa. Our unemployment rate stands at 27%. During the Great Depression, unemployment was at 25%. That can just show you how bad unemployment is in South Africa. What do we need in South Africa? We need transformative constitutionalism. Transformative constitutionalism has been described as entailing a long-term project of constitutional enactment, interpretation, and enforcement to transforming the country's political, social institutions and power relations in a democratic, participatory, and egalitarian direction. It envisages social change through a non-violent political process. Now, since the end of apartheid, there has been concerted legal and political processes aimed at correcting the wrongs of the past and establishing an egalitarian constitutional order. But these efforts have not been enough. The Constitutional Court has consistently emphasized that the Constitution is committed to remedial, restitutionary, and substantive equality. So there's a difference between formal equality and substantive equality. Formal equality simply requires that all persons are equal bearers of rights. On this view, inequality is an aberration that can be eliminated by extending the same rights and entitlements to all. Formal equality does not take into account actual social and economic disparities between groups and between individuals. Substantive equality, on the other hand, requires an examination of the actual social and economic conditions of groups in order to achieve and in order to determine whether the Constitution's commitment to equality is being upheld. The focus of the Constitutional Court on a substantive view of equality takes social and economic conditions of groups and individuals into consideration when determining the meaning of equal treatment. Substantive equality thus takes into account the lived realities of people. The call for substantive equality emerges from an understanding of inequality as rooted in political, social, and economic divisions. It acknowledges the complexity of inequality, its systematic nature, and its entrenchment in social values. Substantive equality is closely related to transformative constitutionalism. Former Chief Justice Pius Langa, he said that substantive equality requires a social and economic revolution. This is what has not happened yet in South Africa. The social and economic revolution to address the imbalances of the past, to dismantle systematic inequalities, to eradicate poverty and disadvantage, and to affirm the human identity, dignity of every person. The fundamental right and foundational value of equality, because equality is a foundational value in our Constitution, must be understood with reference to human dignity and is inherently linked to the adjudication of justiciable socio-economic rights under the South African Constitution. The approach of the judiciary, and particularly our court, to the adjudication of equality-linked matters is essential to addressing the legacy of disproportionate disparity in wealth and access to opportunity in South Africa. In an earlier case this year, in a case involving Parliament's constitutional duties, the Constitutional Court stressed that land and dignity were fundamental to realizing other constitutional rights, and that land reform could be a catalyst for structural change in our society. That if everybody had access to an opportunity to own land, it will fundamentally change their lives. Now, when I tell you about inequality in South Africa. I speak from personal experience. The Supreme Court of Appeal, which used to be the highest court in South Africa before the Constitutional Court, was based in Bloemfontein. Excuse me. Those of you who know a little bit about South Africa's background will know that Bloemfontein was a stronghold of Afrikanerdom, of white people. Asian people, Indians, commonly referred to, were not allowed to live and work in Bloemfontein during the apartheid era. My father's family is from the Eastern Cape. To get to the Eastern Cape by road, we traveled through Bloemfontein. When I was about 5 years old, we had stopped there. My mother sent me into the shop to go and buy bread. And I went into the front door and I asked, there was a white lady working at the counter for bread, and she said they don't have bread. And I could see the loaves of bread on the side. So I went, I told my mother, they said they don't have. My mother said, did you go into the shop? I said, yes. She said, no, all black people have to go to the window to be served from the window. So I went to the window and bought bread on the same lady who had told me when I went into the shop that there was no bread. When you're appointed as a judge in Bloemfontein at the Supreme Court of Appeal, which is an amazingly impressive and historic building, you get a key to that court. And it struck me when I was appointed there that as a 5-year-old I couldn't enter a store. But in 2010, I was given a key to what was just before the highest court in the land and entrusted to dispense justice and to make sure that little girls like me and boys and everybody else would never be treated the way I was treated and the way so many other people, millions and millions of people were treated before them. So, when I speak about the previous inequalities, I speak also from my own personal experience. Both my parents did not finish high school. Not because they were not able to, but it was at a time when not many black people did finish school. And it was also not encouraged by the government. They didn't want what one would call clever black people in order to keep people in subservience and in menial jobs. When I was 16, when they reached the age of 16, they had to leave school in order to get employment and help the family support the other children at home. My mother had no trade. She worked as a cashier at a large department store, and my father worked in the construction industry. And that was also an industry plagued by inequality. It was an industry that was affected by the economic cycle. So the employers and the companies did not hire people like my father permanently because when they had no work, they hired them as casuals. When they had no work and there was a slump in the company, they would just dismiss them. And in that time, there would be no income at our home. So my father would go and cut grass for the white people living on the other side of the hill, just in order to put bread on the table. And that was when my mother started making sweets and having this little home industry. And I think I was a wise businesswoman. I don't know what now it's mergers and acquisitions, but I took over her business. When I was 5 years old, my father told me that I'd go to university. I didn't know what a university was. At that stage, the only university in South Africa where brown people like me could go was in the Western Cape. And in the Western Cape they spoke Afrikaans, which is the colonial master's language. And my father sent me to an Afrikaans school because he knew that for me to survive at university, I would need to speak Afrikaans. In primary school, Afrikaans was my first language. When I completed primary school and into high school, my father said, okay, well now, you know enough of Afrikaans, now you need to learn English. So he put me in an English school. And my first day at high school, I had all these people talking English around me. It was like a totally foreign language. And when the principal came, he said, is everybody in the right place? I said, no, sir, I need to be in an Afrikaans class. So he put me in the Afrikaans class and I went out and I told my father, the principal said I couldn't do English. I had to do Afrikaans. You tell my father I'll deny it. What do you think he'll believe? So the next year we moved away from that school, and that was the only school for brown people. You could go for Afrikaans. I had to go to an English school. For the first year in school I didn't speak. I think people thought there was something wrong with me because everything I knew was in a different language. But at the end of my high school career, I got the best prize for the best English student and the best Afrikaans student. My time was almost up. I only had 10 minutes left. From the age of 16, I started working at the department store my mother worked. I worked every weekend, every school holiday, and that lasted all through until I finished my law degree. In addition to that, I had other jobs as well. I worked at the law library for 3 hours every evening, and on the Saturday, the law student used to run a law clinic, the legal aid clinic in town, and I used to work at the legal aid clinic. So it feels like all my life I've been working, but I have no regrets. And being a woman and being black, I think I've had to work twice as hard as my male counterparts to succeed. My last message is especially for the students here this evening. In 2016, together with 3 friends, I summited Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest peak on the African continent. Not one of us had an athletic bone in our body. We were 4 ordinary women who accomplished an extraordinary feat. We trained, we planned for a year. None of us were overly fit, overly physical, or fitness gurus. And what I want to say to you is that in each of our lives, we have different experiences and we have different obstacles. We need to identify our obstacles and set our goals. I'm not saying that we all need to summit Kilimanjaro, but we each have our own Kilimanjaro. But we must identify our Kilimanjaro. We set our goals and we must plan. Now I ask you today, especially young people, identify what your Kilimanjaro is. Identify what you need to summit your Kilimanjaro. One of the ladies in my group recently wrote a book that she uses as a training manual about her trip to Kilimanjaro. And she sent me excerpts for me to agree for her to mention me in the book. And what she said about me in the book was that she knew that I wasn't athletic, but she also knew, well, this is the principle that she wants to get across. She says, when you plan something, surround yourself with like-minded people. Surround yourself with people who themselves want to succeed and who would want you to succeed. And she said when she asked me to do Kilimanjaro. She knew that I'm the kind of person who, when I set my mind to something, I will achieve it. So surround yourself with people who will help you to reach your goal. Surround yourself with people who will help you to make the world a better place, who think like you, who will act like you, and who won't detract you from your course. Everyone can rise above their circumstances and achieve success if they are dedicated and passionate. And if you take just one message from what I've said today, let it be that regardless of your circumstances, regardless of the inequality that you may be born into, regardless of the inequality that you may face along the way, regardless of the discrimination that you will face, you will achieve your dreams if you're willing to work for them. You can always, always rise above your circumstances. Now, Maya Angelou said, "You may write me down in history with your bitter lies, but still, like dust, I rise. You may shoot me down with your arrogance, your words, your hatefulness, but still, like dust, I rise. I rise from a past that's rooted in pain. I rise from a past that's rooted in poverty. I rise from a past that's rooted in inequality. I rise from a past where domestic violence is rife. I rise from a past where I witnessed people being killed or seriously injured in weekend drunken brawls or in gang violence. I rise from a past where my mother would fervently pray that it was not her son involved in that fatal brawl. I rise from a past where the cries of a woman being beaten will haunt me forever. I rise from a past where I could not help a nephew who wrote me a letter from prison asking for $1. I rise from a past where police officers would raid our home. I rise from what my grandmother considered an undignified past, where she would be afraid to speak her mother tongue of Zulu language, lest she lose her home or be separated from her brown children. I rise from an unjust past where my father was locked up by the police on his way from work on Friday and had to spend the entire weekend in a prison because the work tools he was carrying was identified as a dangerous weapon by the white policeman. I rise from a past where teenage pregnancy was the norm. I rise from a past where I was a lesser human being. I rise from a past where I was mocked for being a woman in a man's world. I rise from a past where fellow judges tried to humiliate me in court. But still, I rise. On 8 May 1996, on the occasion of the passing of the new Constitution of South Africa, the then Vice President of South Africa, Mr. Thabo Mbeki, delivered a moving speech about what it meant to be African. And the speech was entitled, "I am African. Today I say, I am African. I say that Africa will rise from the ashes. Whatever the difficulties, Africa shall be at peace. Africa will rise from corruption. Africa will raise leaders of integrity, where the right of equality will be realized. We will see the rainbow nation dreamed of by Mr. Mandela. Africa will rise and rise." I thank you.
Justice Theron, thank you for that incredibly moving interweaving of the personal narrative that is also the trajectory of a nation, and for the inspiration of your speech. We have some time for questions, okay, microphones, so I'll just gather a few and then have some responses. So yes.
Well, thank you so much for your speech. I was wondering, so with the new constitution, is there a case or a few cases of specific laws that have been overturned because they weren't discriminatory? And I mean, have you seen that the constitution indeed was useful in changing the legal, the discriminatory? And I mean, which cases specifically were
There's actually been lots. A very recent one was the marijuana case, and one in particular where we got the feeling that the government was dragging its heels and wanting the court to make a decision which might not be a popular decision. So we had to find that, or we did find that the laws preventing people, especially adult people, from exercising their right to smoke marijuana in the privacy of their home violated their personal rights. We had another case in customary law. The male always inherits. So we declared that law contrary to the spirit and values of the Constitution. There has been, you must remember, apartheid and discrimination was introduced formally in 1947-48. So all those laws are on our statutes book. And recently we noticed that there was one that was specifically not appealed or repealed, and specifically from an area that was a self-governing territory before, and it applied to women married in that area, in that province, and we declared that law unconstitutional. But there's been many, many examples where that has happened.
Yes, and if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself.
I'm a former student here. My name is Sam Bosky. The flyer, which is possibly a related question, the flyer we've been given mentions that the South African Constitution is one of the rare constitutions to allow for judicial enforcement of socioeconomic rights. And I wonder if you could briefly explain that and maybe some examples of socioeconomic rights that the court has done, and what the limits of it are. What has the court not been able to do under this kind of power?
The enforcement of socio-economic rights is an area where the court has been particularly active. A few years ago, the government refused to make antiretroviral drugs available to everyone, and the court forced them to do that. In terms of land, the court has given progressive judgments in relation to land and access to land and rights to land. Another area where the court has also been very, very progressive is in mining and mineral exploration. Now, the holders of mining rights generally are entitled to come onto your property and to start digging for minerals. The Constitutional Court has said that mining rights must not be exercised in a manner that violates the landholder's right to live on the land, and that there must be consultation, and that the exercise of those rights must take, of the mineral rights, must take into account the exercise of the landowner and their use of the land as well.
Yes.
My name is Stuart Watson. I'm a first-year student. So I'm really interested in environmental rights. And in South Africa, Section 24 of the Constitution allows people not to be harmed from the environment. Canada, we don't have any equivalent to that right now in our Constitution. But I personally believe within Section 7, right to life, and Section 15, equality rights, it can implicitly be read there. I'm wondering if you have any comments on how to promote a healthy environment to protect citizens from that, and if there's any differences in South Africa versus mining communities.
The unfortunate reality in South Africa is that people who are most adversely affected by, for example, mining, waste is the poorer end of the communities, and that's where you find that things are being dumped, and medical waste, and the waters are being contaminated with oil spillages and all that. Historically in South Africa, because of our struggle against apartheid, environmental activism took second place, where people is fighting for the right to vote and the right to freedom. Takes precedence over environmental rights, and we're seeing the devastating effects of that now. But you also have to understand the reality. People are struggling for work and for jobs, and they want to put food on the table. And a lot of those same people are saying they're not interested in the environment right now. While the environment is a fixed thing, but those are the priority issues in South Africa.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. So yes, go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Roberta College. I've never studied law, but my father studied law and graduated law at Yale. He studied with Maxwell Collin, both Wallenberg and F.R. Scott, among others. He was often thought of as the heroic era, a certain heroic era from the Yale law answer occurs in every generation because the students revere their teachers. And my question is to what extent in South Africa do persons who are victims of violent crime and abuse of the police, when they file those complaints about the police, what is the system like in South Africa? And does the file automatically go to the battle of the person who does not have legal representation? Could the file automatically go to the bar so that the bar organizes legal representation for a person who's been a victim of violent crime? I want to assure you that that does not happen here. I have been unconscious on the floor of the police station and filed a complaint. And I will let you know that the police in Montreal treat the victim of crime like the criminal. And there's no automatic right to representation. When that complaint is filed to something called Lectureship, the ethics commission of the police, the file does not go to the battle so that a person with illegal representation receives it. And when they the victim of violent crime in the community, right here in Montreal, in a so-called advanced industrial democracy. I'll be happy to send you a copy of the file number.
Unfortunately, we don't have a system of providing legal representation to the victim of violent crime.
Social and economic rights.
We do actually have a struggle with access to justice. We have a struggle with the right. Everyone has a right to legal representation. In criminal cases, where there could be a severe penalty imposed, an accused has the right to legal representation provided by legal aid. So in all criminal matters, the accused can get a lawyer by legal aid. In civil matters, we apply what is called the means test. So only people earning below a certain income is entitled to legal representation in civil matters. If you meet the means test, if you qualify, you will get a lawyer at state expense.
So I'm going to use the. Thank you for your comments and interventions, and they raise serious questions about the access to justice issues that arise. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative just to ask a question that has been around flows around the framing that you so rightly did of transformative constitutionalism and substantive equality and the jurisprudential borrowing that we both have in Canada and South Africa. We're also both grappling with what you put squarely on the table, settler colonialism. Right? And so my rather broad question in relation to that is whether the framing through equality itself gets us close enough to dealing with the magnitude of unsettling settler-colonial relationships.
I think equality is just a start. It's just the start of change. And there's so much more that leads from there.
Mm.
And it's access to economy, access to economic wealth, access to opportunity, access to medical care, access to schooling. It's it cuts across the stratosphere, because that is the true sense of empowering a person to live a dignified life and to shake off all the shackles that come with colonialism.
Thank you. Yes,
Bianca.
Thank you, Justice, for your words. I just had a question with respect to broad-based Black economic empowerment. It was a revolutionary introduction by South Africa, and I wondered, in your opinion, what was the main challenge that the government faced when they moved from the theoretical framework to actual implementation? And do you think that a new wave of BE holds promise to mitigate a lot of the systemic inequities that the country is facing? And do you think that it could potentially necessitate a more aggressive strategy with respect to land reform?
I think the concept of Black economic empowerment is a wonderful one. The difficulty comes in implementation. And it's not only in the economic sphere where you have to redress imbalances. It's in all spheres. The fact that I became a judge at the age of 32 was partly to address a problem of lack of women judges and Black judges in the judiciary. In the normal course, in the normal trajectory, I would not have been a judge at the age of 32. But it was a need at a specific time. In 1994, when we became a democracy, in the whole of South Africa, there was one woman judge and one Black judge. But the answer lies in how it is implemented. Many people will tell you in South Africa that it has not been properly implemented, that it's not broad-based, that in fact, Black economic empowerment has resulted in an elite group or a small group of Black people becoming multi-millionaires, billionaires even, but at a broader level, it has not had an impact. And it has also led in some instances to what is called fronting, where people even make their domestic workers sign registration certificates to say that they own shares in the company and things like that.
yes.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I would like to quote one of the Nelson Mandela's 1994 speech. He proclaimed that never again shall it be that this beautiful land will be an experience of oppression of one versus another. But in recent governments in South Africa, we've seen the attack of Black South Africans and other Black foreigners in South Africa. You think we're losing sight of the labor nation and their imperial. And my next question is, what role can the Constitution portray in dealing with the xenophobia, especially with the lack of response from the government?
The lack of
Response from the government, or at least government officials, fueling the attack.
Let's deal with the first question, whether we're losing sight of the Rainbow Nation. I think maybe yes, we are. The xenophobia that you see is multifaceted and it's complex. There are so many factors that lead to that. And if you look at it, it's also class related because we have many foreign nationals in different spheres, professional spheres. They are not being attacked. It's at the lower level of the food chain because there's someone that sees them as being threatened. So where does the problem lie? Does the problem lie with our porous borders? Does the problem lie with officials at immigration that has been bribed to let hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people in all the time? With that, there's a burgeoning overload on all social services. And yes, the government needs to play a role. At the time of the xenophobic attacks, there was actually a meme, and the meme had a picture of our president, and it says, "Missing man. If anybody sees the president, please can you tell him to report to the presidency because the country is in a national crisis and we need direction." So for a while, the president was missing in action. We need, so, and then I ask, is the problem a lack of an appropriate response from the government? All these are questions and problems that need answers. I don't have all the answers.
I believe we have time for one more question. I'll acknowledge. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Donna Daskell, and I'm a senator from the other great city of Toronto. I just want to say first, thank you so much for your comments. I've been involved in bringing an exhibit about Nelson Mandela from the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg to Toronto, and I hope that exhibit is coming to Montreal, so I just want to throw that out. Given the amount of inequality that you have described, why hasn't the government been able to use taxation policy tools to redress this? It's usually effective in doing so. You could tax property, maybe income is more difficult to tax, but it's a policy tool that can be used, and I wonder if the country has used it and how effectively and why it may not have used it more to achieve equality.
I don't have the exact statistics, but I think it's less than 20% of South Africa's population that are income taxpayers. 20%. And they are at the maximum. It's going to be like taking water out of a stone. Government is going to have to look at other forms of taxes, whether it's going to be property tax, wealth tax, but the ordinary income tax levels. And with the increasing social security grants and social security assistance that's been given, and with such a small tax base, that tax base has been threatened. And the question is, how long can the small tax base support the requirements of the government and of the people? There needs to be economic transformation. That's what there needs to be, economic transformation and real broad-based economic opportunities.
Justice Theron, I sense this could go on for some time, and I want to acknowledge your tremendous generosity with your time and with your insights for responding to such a broad range of questions that all come from a place of deep concern. And I'd say a sense of solidarity with how South Africa has embraced the challenge of moving toward equality and continues to deal with the persisting inequality, but also to offer so many lessons to the rest of us about how to think deeply about issues of social transformation. So thank you very much for a compelling, personal, and rigorously constitutional framing of the issue of equality and for embodying it for us here today.
And I just would like to emphasize the similarity between the struggle between South Africa and Canada, even today. Yesterday, I was with some of the graduate students, and two areas in particular that I can see similarity just from what we spoke about in an hour is the question of language and the question of gender transformation. So we can learn from each other, and wherever I go in the world, I say, we don't need to reinvent the world. We need to have closer cooperation between countries, between people, and work closely together. I want to thank the Centre, I want to thank the Director and the Executive Director, and to Professor Del Blackett for the warmth that I've been received with here, the graciousness and the hospitality. And even though my visit is very small, I go back tomorrow, I take with me fond memories, and I hope to be returning soon, and we look forward to seeing some of you in South Africa.